The date is April 14, 1912, from Southampton, England, to New York and New York City, USA. Passenger liner RMS Titanic.
Tim, great to have you back on History here.
It's great to be here, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Well, at 11:30 that night, how's the voyage going? Pretty good, I expect.
The voyage has been going really well. It's Titanic's maiden voyage. The weather has been absolutely perfect. The sea is like a plate of glass, so everyone's loving the fact that no one's feeling seasick. They've been exploring the restaurants, the libraries. They've been even playing squash. There's a swimming pool on Titanic. So they're amazed at all these new things like elevators that they haven't seen before, electric gymnasiums, and people are just really feeling that the ship is so beautiful, and they're complimenting Ismay and Andrews on the beauty of the ship.
So 11:15, 11:20, still a few people in the restaurant, some people have gone to bed. What exactly is going on board?
That's absolutely right. At about that time, people are starting to go to bed. And in fact, on this night, they were going to bed a bit earlier than they normally would have done because it's freezing cold, Dan. Titanic's arrived in the Labrador Current. The water's actually below freezing. In fact, at 9:30, Lightoller, who's on duty on the bridge, has asked the carpenter to keep an eye on his cold water, his fresh water supplies, so they don't actually freeze. So everyone's thinking it's so cold, I'm going to go to bed with a cup of hot bovril or a cup of soup or something like that.
Were the ice warnings ignored? Were they worried about hitting a great big iceberg?
It's very easy for historians to chat with the benefit of hindsight and blame the people that were there. And what I want to do today is really put you back into the mindset of being on Titanic. And it's very important to understand that in Titanic, in the time of Titanic, captain after captain testified that they would continue their course and speed until they actually sighted ice, trusting that they would have time to avoid it. In fact, Dan, in 1912, the danger of the ice region was actually the danger of fog.
Yeah, it was astonishing weather in some ways, wasn't it?
Oh, it was the clearest night. All the survivors said it was the clearest night we'd ever seen.
Not a breath of wind.
The stars were actually reflecting in the surface of the Atlantic like a mill pond. And in fact, Beasley actually says that it seemed that there were more stars in the sky than gaps between the stars.
And so they thought, let's make speed while we can.
That's right. It's crystal clear, Dan. It's one of the clearest nights they will ever have encountered. In fact, it's possible because of the atmospheric conditions that they may have been able to see about 80 miles that night, whereas normally you'd only see sort of 20 or 30 miles. So what they were doing, you're absolutely right, is they were really trying to capitalize on this perfect weather to get through it before the barometer dropped and the fog came down. Because it should be understood that once the fog comes down, Titanic has to go dead slow. And the problem is Titanic needs to be doing 6 knots to have steerage weight. Otherwise she needs tugs to maneuver her. So you could argue she's actually more dangerous when she's going below 6 knots than when she can turn fast. Because the faster she goes, Dan, the quicker she can turn. They were all aware of ice. In fact, Murdoch, who was on duty at the time,
he's one of the officers.
He's the first officer, Murdoch, and actually Captain Smith really rated him because Murdoch was the guy with the quick reactions. So there was a time when Murdoch was in an earlier ship and a sailing vessel suddenly came out of the fog kind of across the front of his ship, and the normal officer went to spin the wheel to avoid the collision, and Murdoch ran across the bridge and grabbed the wheel and stopped it turning because he knew if they tried to avoid the collision, they'd have a collision. Whereas if they actually kept it dead on, then they wouldn't. This was an earlier vessel, you understand. So when the Titanic was due on her maiden voyage, it was supposed to be Lightoller, the first officer, but Smith said, I want Murdoch. And Murdoch was used to being on the Olympic with Smith, which was Titanic's twin sister.
Yeah, we've got a picture of her up here. Yeah. So almost identical twin.
That's right. So these ships, Dan, were the biggest ships in the world at the time. 50,000 tons. They could take 3,000 people. They had 4 funnels, which reassured everyone that they were the strongest, biggest ships. In fact, Dan, the 3rd funnel was actually for ventilation. So she only actually needed 3, but they thought she looked better with 4. So these ships were the marvel of the age. And the other thing that gave them confidence, Dan, is that you could actually sort of, if you like, sort of chainsaw the ship into three sections, and each section would have floated indefinitely. As we'll find out later, that isn't what happened.
Okay, Tim, the big moment. Suddenly, the lookout sees an iceberg. What time is it and what happens?
So it's just before 11:40, Dan. It's probably about 11:38 and 40 seconds, something like that. They just start to see what they describe as a dark berg coming out of the haze in front of them.
Tim, I know you've written an entire thesis about this, but why didn't they see that iceberg in time?
Well, this is the extraordinary thing, Dan. They didn't see it because it was so clear. Which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but joking apart, Dan, they had just come from a very warm part of the sea called the Gulf Stream into a freezing part of the sea called the Labrador Current. And this actually made it that the air was very cold down below and much warmer higher up. And what this creates is a bit of haze at the horizon. Sailors call it abnormal refraction. And in fact, many ships in the area of Titanic's crash talked about abnormal refraction. And unfortunately, this refraction is a layer of haze at the horizon, and it just slightly reduced the contrast with the berg. And what that meant was they probably saw it 10, 15 seconds later than they would otherwise have done.
Tim, did they have binoculars and would that have helped?
Well, they didn't have binoculars. They wanted binoculars. They would normally have had binoculars. They were actually left behind and locked away in the cabin because when Lightoller was switched for Murdoch, in fact, they bumped off one of the officers and he had the key of the binoculars in his pocket. So he went back to Belfast and they couldn't get the binoculars. However, Dan, it's not all bad news because the best way to spot ice at night is with the naked eye. And that's because you need a wide field of vision to actually be able to see the berg coming out of the darkness. But in fact, what Titanic wanted, they wanted the ring of 3 bells, and 3 bells signified object dead ahead. Now, if they'd had binoculars, they might have been tempted to inspect the object after they detected it. But all the officers on the bridge wanted from the lookouts was to just detect the object and immediately, prior to inspection with binoculars, ring the bell.
And that's what happens.
That's what happens. Is as soon as they see this what they see is this dark berg. In fact, it was a brilliant white berg, but it appeared to them dark. They rang 3 sharp rings on the crow's nest bell. Now, Murdoch had been standing on the starboard wing bridge, and that's because there was glass in front of the bridge, and of course you'd get bits of spray on there, although they kept it very clean. But Murdoch knew they were approaching the ice area. He knew they were doing 22.5 knots. So he wanted to have no glass between him and the bergs, as it were. The lookouts have been on duty for over an hour as well, so they're going to be quite cold. But nevertheless, they see the berg, they immediately give the 3 rings. And what Murdoch does is he basically he dashes onto the bridge, the wheelhouse area. And what's fascinating is people don't really tend to realise this, but the wheel itself, Titanic ship's wheel, is actually in its own room, Dan. It's in a little cubicle with the curtains drawn so that the compass binnacle of the compass by the wheel will not splash light onto the bridge. And this is because the officers want to have their eyes in.
So we've got a 3D rendering of Titanic here. So this is the bridge up here, is it?
That's absolutely right. So what we've got here, we've got the lookouts high up, about 80 feet above the water in what's called the crow's nest.
Is this the crow's nest here?
That's right. That's
there's the bell.
Nest. Yeah, that's right. And there's the bell. So that's the bell that they ring several times. And then if we go over here, you've got the starboard wing bridge. So that is where Murdoch was looking out over that low rail there. And then he dashes onto the bridge. And what he does is the first thing he does is he rings full astern on the Titanic's engines to slow the vessel. He also orders hard starboard. In layman's terms, he gave the order hard left turn.
And that's signalling to the engine room.
That's exactly right. Signalling to Chief Engineer Bell. Now, he is right back here. He's sort of 500 feet further back.
Wow.
And 100 feet further down. So Engineer Bell's here where these giant reciprocating engines are. And Dan, just to give you an idea, these are the biggest reciprocating engines ever built. They're 4 stories high, all right? They're all having their cups of bovril and soup and things. And then suddenly this order comes through full astern. It's not like nowadays where you'd flick a switch and the electric engines would just go in reverse. This is the case where they have to wait for the engines to slow down to a stop. And then they have to order the steam into the other chambers to get them to go in reverse.
Right, and we've got the rudder. We can see the rudder back here, can't we? So that's the thing that's actually controlling the direction of the vessel.
That's absolutely right. And it's it's fascinating, Dan, because people look at that and they think, well, hang on, the ship's 882 feet long. The rudder's only, I don't know, 20 feet long. Yeah. It must be too small. But actually, Dan, we know from the Olympic was actually the only merchant vessel to ram and sink an enemy submarine in the First World War.
And very agile.
She did that because she was so agile. And as I said, the faster she's going, the quicker she turned. And actually, Dan, Titanic turned in time to her stem actually missed the iceberg that they could see above the water.
So the bow goes, the pointy bit at the front, the bow just left. And they think, we've made it, we've made it. Okay, well, time check. About 23:40 now?
That's right, bang on, Dan. 23:40, 11:40 p.m. We have the collision. And
terrible sound.
Terrible sound. So it sounds different from people all over the ship. So if you're down in the boiler rooms down there, it sounded like a roll of thunder. If you're one of the passengers up like Beasley in second class, it sounds like calico being ripped. Someone said it sounded like a boat being pulled up on a gravel beach. And then to Smith comes running out of his chart room, which is part of the bridge.
Right, we should say, because Captain Smith, he wasn't down drinking with the high rolling guests. He was on the bridge.
Another myth we should bust, because Captain Smith actually never drank at sea. He had been having a party, but funnily enough, they made sure that the crew actually took his glasses off the table so that the people in the restaurant could see that he wasn't drinking at all. And he never drank at sea. Also, people say he was in bed. Actually, he wasn't in bed. People say that because he did rush out from the chart room onto the bridge. And his cabin, where he slept, was also beyond the chart room.
Captains always have a little cabin, don't they? Right as close to the bridge.
That's right. But actually, we know from Light Alert that Smith was on and off the bridge the whole time and working out star sites and very much on duty at the time, although the person actually in charge of the actual watch, the officer in charge of the watch was Murdoch. But Smith remained in charge of the ship, and there was no way, Dan, that Smith was going to turn in when he knew they were in the ice region.
Tim, has anyone perished by this stage? Were people killed in that initial collision down there in the depths of the hull?
Not yet. In fact, there is someone called Fred Barrett who falls into an open manhole cover that's open because they're trying to get the pumps from the stern to come in and help with the front. And because of all the steam, because they're trying to put the fires out in the boilers, he falls into this manhole cover and breaks his leg. But no one has died at this stage.
So Titanic has smashed into this iceberg. But tragically, not just bang on. This is the terrible thing, Tim. If it just hit the iceberg, we might not be talking about it today.
Dan, that's absolutely true. So Titanic had 16 watertight compartments, and she could float with any 2 of them open to the sea. And that's because, if you can imagine, Dan, that there's a collision like that, which actually happened with Olympic with HMS Hawke, for example. If another ship had speared Titanic between a bulkhead, the automatic doors would have automatically come down with the floats. As the water came in, it lifted floats, the heavy doors dropped down. It was a foolproof system. In fact, they went further than that. They made it so that she could float with any 4 of her forward watertight compartments flooded. But guess what? This glancing blow of the berg, if you like, just gently, if you like, scraping along the side of Titanic. I mean, enormous forces, of course, Dan. But what it meant was, instead of slowing up Titanic, it meant that it actually ripped, it knocked the heads off the rivets over a 200-foot section of Titanic. Now, to put that in perspective, Dan, see this sort of fireplace we've got here. The actual damage that the iceberg did to Titanic was no bigger in volume, Dan, in total, than the size exactly of this fireplace.
What?
Yeah.
The hole in the size of Titanic was no bigger than a metre squared, 2 metres squared.
Correct.
Wow.
However, it wasn't a hole, Dan. If only it had been a hole, Titanic would have survived. The problem is, what she did is the iceberg didn't make a hole at all. What it did was it smashed in, dented the plates, which is like a patchwork quilt made of steel. And if you like, with your patchwork quilt, the cotton that sews the patches together, they're the rivets. And what it did was, it went for the weakest point in a very strong structure. Now, the weakest point, just like, in my jersey, it's probably the seam here. It'll rip in the seam. Well, the seams on the Titanic's hull were these rivet heads. So what happened was the enormous explosive force of the iceberg, which was, had tens and hundreds of thousands of tons of pure water, and Titanic, which was 50,000 tons, they were going to come off badly, and Titanic came off worse because her rivet heads got popped off. And what that meant was, over a 200-foot gash, there was just water spurting in along the seams. She was just leaking like a sieve then, Dan, along 200 feet. And the critical problem is, if she'd neatly filled her first 4 bulkheads, she'd have been absolutely fine.
Yeah, if she'd rammed head on into an iceberg or a rock.
She'd have been absolutely fine. In fact, Dan, bizarrely, if she'd hit head on, it wouldn't even have thrown people out of their beds, because she was doing 22 knots. It would have smashed in the first 100 feet. And if you go from 20 miles an hour in 100 feet in a car, you're not even going to be thrown through the windscreen or anything. Do you see what I mean? So actually, it would have been quite a gentle and should have floated indefinitely. But remember we were talking about the ice shelf, and what happened was that damaged the floor of the end boiler room. Yes.
Let's look at the underside of the hull.
That's right. So the damage starts early on here and goes all the way back to what we call the turn of the bilge up here. But more than that, Dan, this whole shelf is doing damage to what we call Titanic's keel, which is the flat-bottomed area here. And then what happened was some of the plates underneath were damaged in the 5th watertight compartment, and that's the end boiler room. And when Andrews, who designed Titanic, or helped design it and helped build it, he was actually travelling on the maiden voyage. And when he realised it was leaking into number 5, he knew that the pumps in the stern were not sufficient to keep the water down.
Front 4, you can manage.
Manage
so
forever.
It's that one extra compartment.
Yeah, it was probably a couple of feet too far.
Really?
Yeah.
So if they'd had another 2 seconds on that big turn to port, they probably could have just about made it, you reckon?
100%.
Or if they just kept going and bashed it head on.
Yeah, I think Murdoch would have been fired if they bashed it head on, because the captain would have been like, why didn't you try and avoid it? In fact, Murdoch did 2 things. We talked earlier about the harder starboard, the famous harder starboard order. But there's a much less famous order, which Quartermaster Oliver noted when he came onto the bridge at that time, which was harder port. So what happened was that they were going harder starboard to move the bow to the left, and then they were exposing all of the right-hand side of the stern of Titanic. So what Murdoch wanted to do was flick the tail of the ship away. And this gives you an idea, Dan, of actually how well the ship did turn, because he did flick the stern away, and that's why the damage stopped.
In the minutes that follow, so 41, 42, 43, what decisions are being made? Is there sort of panic on the bridge, or are they doing stuff?
Well, immediately after the collision, Captain Smith runs onto the bridge and says, what was that? And Murdoch said, it was an iceberg. We've struck an iceberg. And Smith says, close the watertight doors. And Murdoch says, I've already closed them. And then Smith, not the doddery old man that he's portrayed as, Smith goes, get the carpenter to sound the ship. So straight away, he's ordering the carpenter to go and sound the ship.
And that means work out how much water's in the bottom of the ship.
That's right. You've probably seen this with a plumb line. You've got a line with a bit of lead. And what the, I don't know if you can actually see it here, Dan, but on this cutaway of the ship here, that's the bow section there towards you. And there's actually, might be able to see it, there's a little spiral staircase, which looks like a corkscrew that goes right down from top to bottom of the ship. And what the carpenter did, because he was quite a clever chap, is he went to stand on that spiral staircase and he let his plumb line down and he drew it back up, and he was amazed because 10 minutes after the collision only, he had 7 feet of water in Titanic.
Oh, that's bad news.
Well, that is very bad news, because it's not just these first 4 watertight compartments. It also goes into the 5th compartment, and that is outside, Dan, of Titanic's design envelope, because Titanic is built to withstand any sort of normal collision that might happen between 2 vessels at sea. She's even built to have a running aground where she just hits head on. But what she's not designed for is the kind of side swipe disaster that she has.
Like a tin can just opening the...
Absolutely right.
What about the passengers? Are they aware of what's going on now in the minutes that follow?
What really alerts the passengers that there's trouble, Dan, is the engine stopping. Because 10 minutes after the collision, the engine stopped for the last time. And you know, when you're at sea, if anyone's been on a cruise, they'll remember there's always the sort of dancing of the mattress. There might be some clinking of some glasses. There's that shipboard hum. And what happened was, Dan, that shipboard hum stopped. And it was really, although some people heard and felt the noise of the collision, what woke most people up was the sudden stillness, which at sea in a liner like Titanic, which takes days and days to cross the Atlantic, that's just wrong. And they're like, why have we stopped? So what did they do? So the first thing they did was, have we arrived in New York? Have we hit another boat? Have we run out of coal? What's happened? So they all opened their windows, portholes, to have a look out. And they thought, beautiful starry night, absolutely fine. Must be something, non-critical. And they went back to bed, but a lot of them left the portholes open.
So at that stage, no panic really among the passengers?
Oh, absolutely no panic at all. So even at that stage, even Andrews is saying, before he knows the rate and the extent of damage, even Andrews is saying, we think it'll be all right, okay? It's only when he then goes back up to the bridge and does his calculations and he measures how fast the water's coming in against the ladders that are the escape ladders up the side of the watertight compartments. Because once the doors come down, the stokers who are shoveling coal onto the furnaces, they have to get out. So they've got these escape ladders. And what Andrews does is he watches how the water is climbing up those rungs. And then he goes back to his cabin, which is actually quite near. He's staying in first class. So he's actually near the bridge in his own cabin. And what he does a bit of maths and he thinks, Titanic's only going to last an hour to an hour and a half.
And it's his ship. He knows better than anybody else.
Not only did he help design the ship, but he's the managing director of Holland and Wolff, where she was built. He knows that ship like the back of his hand. Always first into work, always last to turn the lights out. He knows every rivet and every screw on that ship. If there was anyone that could save the ship, the man to do it was on board, Andrew. Here's the class, go!
Okay, 5 minutes in, 23:45. We've got Captain Smith on the bridge. What's he thinking?
He's very worried, Dan, because not only did he feel the collision itself, he was sufficiently worried to order the watertight doors closed. Now, actually, Murdoch, who was the officer in charge of the watch, had already done that. But Smith was sufficiently worried to order the carpenter to go down straight away to sound the ship. But what really worries Smith is there's a little instrument on the bridge called a commutator. And this is a thing which tells how the ship is listing. And he knows it's an absolutely dead calm night. He knows it's like a mill pond out there. And when he looked at that commutator, it's showing a 5-degree list to starboard. So he knows she's making water fast. And in fact, Ismay does ask him, he's the owner of Titanic. Ismay comes onto the bridge and asks the captain, why have we stopped? He says we've hit an iceberg. He says, is it serious? And Smith does say, I believe it is serious.
Tell me about Smith. I mean, was this his last journey? Was he past it? Was he the right man for the job?
Well, all these are in fact myths, as you hint. No, Smith was in his absolute peak. He was the best captain of the White Star Line. He was known as the Commodore of the White Star Line, and they particularly chose him to do every maiden voyage. So he did the Adriatic when she was the biggest ship in the world. He did the Olympic when she was the biggest ship in the world. Now he was doing the Titanic. In fact, Dan, he had every intention of doing the Britannic's next ship's maiden voyage as well. So he was at least 3 years away from retirement. And he'd never really had an accident, apart from the year before in 1911, he liked going fast, and he was racing a Navy vessel called HMS Hawke. And unfortunately, the huge suction from the propellers of Olympic, combined with the shallow water off the Isle of Wight and in Southampton water, actually sucked the Hawke into the side of Olympic. Even on Titanic's maiden voyage, when the passengers were having lunch as they were departing Southampton water, there had been a coal strike. Lots of ships were laid up, and this constricted the channel even more. And actually the New York, which herself was once the biggest ship in the world, she was sucked away from her mooring lines, which snapped, and she was sucked towards Titanic's hull. Now, the relevance of this is that it was quick thinking on Smith's part, putting a touch of thrust on the poor propeller that actually washed New York back into her berth and saved a collision then. Now, ironically, Had Captain Smith not been so quick thinking, on the Wednesday before, when Titanic left Southampton, the voyage would have been cancelled and everyone would have been saved. Captain Smith was known as the millionaire's captain. So I don't know if you can see this photo here, Dan, of him, but he's got a sort of bushy beard, and you would think
he looks the part.
He absolutely looks the part. And you would think that he would always have a voice like a foghorn. In fact, he almost never spoke above a conversational tone. But when he had to reprimand a sailor, he could make them jump off the deck. So they liked him. He was popular with the first-class passengers because he was urbane, intelligent, sophisticated. He could talk about antitrust law and things like that when he was around the first-class dinner table. But when he was with the sailors, he was greatly admired for his speed and caution and safety.
So 23:58, just before midnight, almost 20 minutes after the collision. Captain Smith's obviously thinking about what comes next because he orders the lifeboats to be uncovered.
That's right. This is very significant, and it's almost a window onto Smith's mind because he gives the order at that time to what's called uncover the boats. And that means that take the canvas covers off, start getting ready, start getting the oars and everything out, ready to ship, start swinging out the davits because Titanic had these sort of cranes on her deck which would swing the lifeboats out. So he doesn't yet know if they're going to have to abandon ship because the designer is still, the builder of Titanic is still doing his calculations, but Smith wants to be ready. So he makes sure that the crew start preparing the lifeboats as a precaution.
So in this image of Titanic, you can see the lifeboats. So approximately how many are there on there?
Well, Dan, there are only 20 lifeboats on Titanic, but actually these ones you can see here, these are 16 lifeboats that are what you would call proper clinker built wooden lifeboats. But Titanic also carried 4 collapsible boats. So these had solid sort of flat bottoms, but then you could pull up canvas sides on them. So in total, you could say she had 16 lifeboats and 4 life rafts known as collapsible lifeboats.
Presumably now on the bridge, there's damage reports coming in from different parts of the ship trickling in. The news is bad.
The news on the bridge is terrible, and it's blow after blow. So first of all, the carpenter comes up sort of white in the face in a bit of a dither about how much water the ship is making. Then the mail clerks rush up and want to know where the captain is because Titanic's a Royal Mail ship. One of her key things is delivering mail at super fast speed to America. And Dan, 10 minutes after the collision, the mail bags are floating in the mailroom.
Right, and where have we got the mailroom here?
Right, the mailroom's there. Sort of, you see where the mast is, what's called the foremast at the front, where the crow's nest is.
Okay, so right
under that, that's where the mail clerks are.
So right under here.
Yeah, that's right. And the mail bags are floating. So, for example, the cars and stuff that are on Titanic, they're all underwater by now. The crew, the fireman's accommodation is underwater. So at this stage, people down below in the forward also third-class male passengers know there's a problem because their berths are having water coming in because the females in third class were at the stern. So they didn't know anything about it, but the males were in the bow and they knew all about it.
Wow.
Not if they were in families, Dan. I should say men travelling alone in third class were in the bow, women travelling alone in third class were in the stern.
And just while we're here, were they locked in and denied access to escape?
They were not locked below, Dan. So, in fact, there's no easy answer to that question. So let me explain. Rather like during COVID, the gates between third class and the rest of the ship had to be locked. That was the rule. And it was actually insisted upon by US immigration. In other words, what they said was, if you open these gates during the voyage, we're not going to let any of you in at New York. So they had to keep the gates shut. Now, interestingly, at the point that Smith orders the boats uncovered as a precaution, he doesn't yet know that it's an abandoned ship order. And yes, those gates are locked. So actually, third class did try and climb the gates. They tried to barter and bargain with the crew to get them opened. And the crew did not open them until the order to abandon ship is given.
Okay, well, we're going to come to that. So 14 minutes past midnight. We're now on Monday morning?
Monday morning, Dan. 15th of April, 1912.
We're having a bad Monday morning. The lifeboats are ordered to be swung out now on these davits.
That's right. So they've been prepared. The covers have come off. They've got them all ready. And then Smith says, swing them out. And that's the next stage to being, super ready because now they can be actually filled with people.
So, Tim, there's a big myth, isn't there, that the lifeboats were unsightly and there weren't enough of them. Is that true?
Yeah, again, Dan, it's a very hard question to answer, but basically it's not true. So Titanic had 20 lifeboats. In fact, as we'll learn later, Dan, Titanic, although she sank on an even keel, she still sank with some lifeboats attached. So she didn't have enough time, even with all that time, and even on an even keel, to unload all her lifeboats. And armchair historians in the future, without the benefit of hindsight, can say, well, she should have had lifeboats for everyone. But as we know, Dan, from disasters like Costa Concordia and even Lusitania, is that most ships list when they're sinking. And that means you've got to have lifeboats on each side for everyone. So you've got to have then 40 or 50 lifeboats, not 20 or 30. And what the Board of Trade wanted was, instead of ships piled high with lifeboats, that you'd never have enough crew or time to launch. What they wanted was properly subdivided vessels, which only needed to carry enough lifeboats to ferry the passengers, Dan, from a stricken vessel to a nearby rescue ship. So that was the idea, that the lifeboats would be used as ferries between Titanic and nearby ships that would rush to her aid.
18 minutes past midnight now. The band are starting to play?
That's right. So the main thing that Captain Smith wants to avoid is a panic. So he's now ordered people to get their warm clothes on and get up to the boat deck. And so the band is playing actually quite light-hearted music. There was a comedy that was very popular in London at the time called The Merry Widow. And they were playing things like Ghost Dance, which is like a comic tune, for example. And actually, Dan, contrary to expectations, there was quite a lot of merriment going on among the passengers because they believed they were safe. They actually believed Titanic wouldn't sink. They believed it was ridiculous that they were being asked to put their life jackets on. So there were lots of jokes about, you'll need to get some ice from the iceberg for your drink and all that.
So very different mood on the bridge to down where the passengers were.
Oh, yes. On the bridge, it's very serious. Smith's probably even actually sweating. Certainly Lightoller was dripping in sweat at this time. But the passengers are making light of the situation.
What a setup, right? I told.
Past midnight, so we're about 45 minutes-ish after that collision. We've got bad news for the captain from the designer, from the builder of the ship.
That's right. This is the most shocking news of that night, really, because they believe they can cope with everything. They've got huge pumps on board to pump out the water. They've got watertight bulkheads. Titanic even had a double hull on her on her flat keel. But Andrews has now crunched the numbers, Dan, and he comes back and he says she can't stay afloat. With the rate that water is coming in and with the number of compartments it's coming into and with the power of the pumps that we've got on board, it's a mathematical certainty that Titanic will sink. It was such a body blow to Smith, who had a young daughter at home, he had a wife at home. He knew that he probably wasn't going to survive.
Because a captain ought to go down with his ship.
I think Smith was one of those people, he knew it was going to be a very rough night.
Extraordinary moment for Andrews. The pinnacle of his life's work has been designing and building Titanic, and he's the man who says she's going to die.
It must have been an absolute body blow to Andrews as well as Smith. He's put his life and heart and soul, as you say, into building Titanic and her sister, the Olympic. And they're building the third sister, who was going to be called the Gigantic at the moment, to the same specifications. And what he realizes is that this berg has done more damage than they envisaged could ever happen from a collision, because it's ripped 200 feet gap and it's gone into the first 5 watertight compartments. So a little bit about Andrews. He's not your average kind of draftsman. He is also the managing director of Harland and Wolff, and that is the most successful and important shipyard in the world at that time. So he's not only overseen the drawing of Titanic, he's overseen the building of it. He's very popular with the thousands of men in Belfast who've helped rivet Titanic together. He knows every inch of the ship. It's like his child almost. And yet he is faced with the mathematical certainty that she can no longer stay afloat.
Does Smith immediately order abandon ship at that point?
As soon as Smith hears that that's the case, Yes, he orders abandoned ship, he orders the lifeboats swung out and prepared for launch, and at the same time he orders all the stewards from each of the classes to go down and tell passengers to be woken up and to put warm clothes on and their life belts on and to come up on deck. So he orders everyone onto the deck. He even orders the gates between third class and second class to be opened, and he orders first class stewards to go down and usher the third class women and children, is the order, up to the boats.
What about asking for help, getting on the radio?
That's exactly what they do. So as soon as they realise that Titanic is going to sink, they work out their position and they give, there's a stress position. Now, there's the old distress call, which is CQD. Titanic's call signal is MGY. So the first signal that goes out is CQG MGY. But then there's this new signal called SOS, which has only just been brought in by a convention earlier of Marconi operators.
And that's Morse code that is blasted out into the ether. And there's another myth here that people have heard. Do they send out the wrong coordinates?
That's absolutely right. That is not a myth. So the way that Titanic and other ships in 1912 found their position, Dan, was by looking at the stars and how high they were relative to the horizon. So Titanic took her star sights at 7:30, so just before it was completely dark. And unfortunately, obviously, you have to take the star sights on deck, and they have a thing called a hack watch, which is what you and I would call a stopwatch. And what happened was that when Pittman, who was a junior officer, when he actually transferred the time from the star sight at 7:30 onto Titanic's ship's chronometer's time, and Titanic had 3 clocks to make sure that nothing could go wrong, he made an error of 1 minute in transcribing the time. And so Titanic's position was correctly logged, the star sights were correct, but because the time was a minute out, Titanic's position was given as 10 miles too far west, because 1 minute at 42 north, which is the latitude she was at, is 10 miles too far west. So it was the wrong coordinates.
Is anyone on the receiving end of these messages?
Because it was such a clear night, the messages actually travelled much further than they normally would. So they're picked up all over the place. They're picked up at Cape Race on land, about 400 miles away. In fact, Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, picks up the distress signals straight away. Bizarrely, Dan, a couple of rather important ships that don't pick it up is there's a ship only 10 miles away called the Californian. Her radio operator's gone to bed. He's done a 14-hour shift, so he's asleep, so he doesn't pick it up. Even Titanic's eventual rescue ship, the Carpathia, Dan, doesn't actually pick up these distress calls immediately, because what's happening is Cottam is getting ready for bed. He's getting his slippers.
He's the radio operator.
Cottam's the radio operator on the Carpathia. And what he does is he thinks, I'll call my mates on Titanic, because they all knew each other. All these radio operators on the North Atlantic, Dan, they all trained together. And as a term of endearment, they used to call each other old man, which is OM in code. So he said, say old man. And Titanic's then quite rude. Titanic comes in K, which means, what is it? Carry on. What are you saying? And he says, oh, you've got some mail for you at Cape Cod. And then Phillips comes in and says, CQD, SOS, SOS, it's a CQDOM, which means it's a CQD, old man. We are sinking. You've got to come now and have your boats ready. And if Cottam on Carpathia had not telephoned Titanic, he wouldn't have picked up Titanic's distress signal either.
But the Californian was 10 miles away. If they'd responded to the call, that would have been half an hour at 20 knots.
They'd have had to get steam up, Dan. It would probably take them about an hour. So they would have got there at about the time that the last big lifeboats on Titanic were being launched.
I'm Keegan-Michael Key. And Orida,
"40 minutes past midnight. We're now an hour from that collision. We got first lifeboats lowered away."
That's right. So it takes a while for passengers to come up from their cabins with all their sort of motoring coats on and all their life jackets and things. And then the first lifeboat to be launched is lifeboat number 7.
Right, where's lifeboat number 7?
Right, well, okay, she's between the first and second funnel there, Dan, on the boat deck. So, yeah, that is the first class entrance. So the passengers would have come out of this doorway here onto lifeboat number 7, which is right there.
And is this first-class passengers going in this lifeboat?
First-class passengers. So what you have to remember is, broadly speaking, first-class passengers are towards the front of the ship or the bow. Second class are nearer the stern. And, of course, third class are both right at the bow and right at the stern. And there are no lifeboats in that section at all.
These first-class passengers, this is now getting real. They must be scared. Are they excited? What's going on with these passengers as they're being put in the lifeboats?
At this stage, Dan, they are still thinking that it's ridiculous that they're being put off in lifeboats, because in 1912, most ordinary people couldn't swim. It was a freezing night, and they all believed they were better off in the warmth and security of Titanic. They also trusted in radio that ships would be coming to their aid. In fact, to give you an idea of how brave the first passengers were who went in lifeboat number 7, there's a great little story about Dorothy Gibson, who was a beautiful film actress, and she was so sort of attractive that many men had offered their services to protect her on the voyage, which is how they carried on in 1912, Dan. And about 4 of them said, oh, can I look after you on the ship and all this sort of thing. So her favourite, Edward Kent, she met him on the stairs going up to the lifeboat, and she had her most treasured possession on her, which was a gold and ivory miniature of her mother. And what she did is she said, oh, they're making me go in the lifeboat. It's absolutely ridiculous. I'll be on board in the morning for breakfast, but here is this miniature. Can you look after it? Because you're going to stay on the ship, and I want it safe. I'm not having this miniature in a lifeboat. So he looks after it. She gets in the boat and is eventually saved. He goes down with the ship. His body is eventually saved, and in his pocket is her miniature, and she gets it back eventually.
The men are allowed to go. Is it the women going in there?
So men and women are all allowed on the deck. And in fact, Dan, it's different rules on each side of the ship. So on the right-hand side of the ship, although the rule is women and children first, on the right-hand side of the ship, men are allowed to get in when there are no women and children around, or once all the women and children who are nearby have got in. So a lot more people, a lot more men certainly, escape from Murdoch's side of Titanic, which is the side that he's in charge of on the right, whereas Lightoller is in charge of the left-hand side of the ship, and he's much more strict about no men at all. So Astor, the richest man in the world, comes up to Lightoller and says, can I go in with my pregnant wife to look after her? Now, I think Murdoch on the other side would have let him, but Lightoller's like, no men. So the richest man in the world is consigned to die, and his pregnant wife, Madeline, it goes in the lifeboat on her own. And then there's another boy who's only about 14, and Lightoller says he can't go because in 1912, you're a man if you're over 13. And then apparently what Astor does is he puts a lady's hat on the boy and says, now he's a girl and he can go. And he is then allowed to go. And that's where the myth of people dressing up as women comes from. It's actually a young boy who's given a girl's hat.
And were those lifeboats lowered without their full complement?
Well, that's absolutely right, Dan. And again, that sounds very odd from 100 years later. But I can explain why. So what you had emergency lifeboats. And that's called lifeboat number 1. But guess what, Dan? That shared a crane, shared a davit with some of the bigger lifeboats. So what Murdoch wanted to do is get the little lifeboats away quickly because they thought they only had an hour left, and that was really not enough time to launch all the boats. So basically what they were doing is getting the boats launched, and if there were people around, yes, they can all get in, but the chief thing was get the boats away quickly. The other thing they did, Dan, was they opened the doors in Titanic's hull. You can see one of the doors actually open there because it's painted white on the inside. And they opened these gangway doors that were used in port, and they opened those so that the lifeboats could be filled more, they felt, safely. So instead of filling them from 90 feet up, you can see in that photograph up there.
And lowering everyone down.
Yeah, see how far it was to the sea, 80-foot drop in the dark. And so what they wanted to do really was just lower the lifeboats away, then get the people filled from lower down. And they also felt they could have filled them with more people if they filled them from the water.
So yet another myth, Tim, that's not true. That they were callously abandoning people as they lowered half-full lifeboats of toffs down into the sea.
And there's another point there, Dan, that's very important, is that the Board of Trade, in their wisdom, decided that each lifeboat could take 65 people. And this was based on some cubic footage worked out behind a dusty desk in Whitehall. But actually, Dan, when you had 6 oars in the lifeboats, they needed room to swing. So you couldn't pack it with people and have room to swing the oars. The other thing is, people were bringing bits of luggage. Someone had their dog in the lifeboat. Also, people had these huge life jackets and big fur coats. So this was taking up more and more space. And a final thing is, someone like Lightoller was a seaman. He'd actually been wrecked at sea before. He'd been on a desert island even of St. Paul in the middle of the ocean. Anyway, he knew that the wind would come up with the sun in the morning. So he didn't want to load the lifeboats fully because then they would start to get swamped. And in fact, as we'll find out later on, the lifeboats were becoming swamped when they were eventually rescued in the morning.
Try a whole...
So it's 44 minutes past midnight, and we can see there is another ship. We can see lights from another ship.
Well, this is one of the most massive ice barrier that was just ahead of the iceberg that Titanic ran into. It was only when she swung around and what we call opened her lights out to Titanic that suddenly, for example, her masthead light could be seen by Titanic. And the other thing is that Californian had been Morse lamp signaling to Titanic all since she stopped. But now they noticed her Morse lamp signals. So now the two vessels started to Morse lamp signal to each other.
But that's great.
It should be great, Dan, but remember we're talking about the Titanic and everything's a tragedy. So that night, what happened was, because of the very cold water we talked about in the Labrador Current, it had made the air lie in layers of colder, heavier air down below and warmer air higher up. And this added, Dan, to the beauty of the night, because someone like Beasley later on in the lifeboat said that the stars were flashing so much that it seemed like the stars were morsing to each other. Now, the terrible tragedy is that it didn't just make the stars flash, it made the Morse flash randomly.
No.
Yes. So Titanic and Californian decided that they were both looking at vessels burning oil lamps, flickering oil lamps, because it scrambled the sense out of the Morse. And there's something even worse than that, is that the Californian knew that they had a map of all the ships in the area with radio. And they had a map saying the only ship near us with radio is Titanic. And the reason they didn't get their radio out is that because of this raised horizon caused by this very calm weather and this fog bank on the horizon, basically, it made Titanic look like she was only 5 miles away from them. And that made them think she was only 400 feet long, instead of a ship twice as long, twice as far away. So they then concluded that whatever ship that was, it was about the same size as they were and didn't have radio.
So it couldn't be Titanic. So don't bother to turn the radio on. Oh, the tragedy.
Oh, it's tragedy after tragedy after.
So they were within sight of Titanic. That's crazy.
Yes. They were within, as I said, they've been morsing for a long time. A lot of calmness on Titanic was because people were looking on the bridge because Titanic was facing towards Californian. And actually, Smith allowed not just first-class passengers, but also stewards and passengers of all classes to go onto the bridge and actually have a look at what was going on. And they were calm because they believed that the Californian was actually coming towards Titanic. And the reason for that was, remember we said that she'd swung around and opened out her lights, so suddenly she'd appeared. Now, Dan, if you suddenly see a ship just appear, you think it's coming towards you. So they all felt they were about to be rescued.
The Californian had arrived at this big ice island, hadn't hit or anything.
It ran into the shallow ice, which had scared Captain Lord.
And it was just floating about, waiting to work its way around. So the Californian thought they were near a ship without radios, didn't turn their radio on. They couldn't see the Morse lamps, these light signals. Was there any other way of getting in touch?
Well, Titanic had one final way of alerting help, Dan, and this was what's called distress rockets. And these are rockets which went up and went 600 feet high, exploded into a ball of stars, and then came down on little sort of parachutes quite slowly. Now, tragically, because the nearby ship thought they were looking at a smaller, nearer ship than they thought these rockets were coming from much beyond the ship that they were looking at. And unfortunately, the rockets were only really detectable when they were very low down because in that cold air that was magnifying. And so Captain Lord decided that the ship he was looking at was a nearby small vessel, probably got into trouble with its rudder, wasn't answering his Morse lamp signals, didn't appear to be making rocket signals because the rockets appeared to be very low. They appeared to be coming from a ship further away, which is very ironic. And so he thought, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to wait 3 hours till daylight when I can investigate in safety.
Wow. What a litany of so many things had to go wrong for this tragedy to take place.
That's right, Dan.
So the first boat to be lowered is very much from the sort of first class area of the ship. Does that mean it's only first class passengers in there?
Yes. In fact, they did send stewards down to second class and third class to help passengers come up. But their real priority, Dan, was lowering the lifeboats before Titanic sank underneath them. So it just so happened that the first class had these big decks where they stored the lifeboats. So it is logical that the first people on the scene with the lifeboats are first class. But there are other reasons why third class was taking more time to get to a lifeboat.
Are there women who refuse to leave the ship if their husbands can't come with them?
Oh, absolutely. This happened quite a bit, especially, I would say, Isidore and Ida Strauss. So they actually owned what's Macy's department store. They were very wealthy, quite older couple. And it was regarded really that Isidore Strauss, the gentleman, would have been allowed into a lifeboat because he was quite old and very important, and she was frail and needed someone to be with him. But he absolutely refused. He said, "I will not get in a lifeboat before other men." And so she said, because she was pretty terrified as well of going out in a small boat without him on the North Atlantic in the dark. So she said, "I would rather stay with my husband, so I will stay." So she elected to stay because he wasn't allowed in.
And did they perish?
They did. It's believed they went down to their cabin together and drowned together.
We're at 47 minutes past midnight, Tim. We're over an hour since the collision. First of all, are there any casualties yet? Has anyone drowned down below?
They haven't drowned down below. What's happened is, Dan, a lot of the engineers have what's called damped the boilers because to avoid explosions, because what they didn't want was freezing seawater pouring into red hot boilers and then exploding. So in fact, one of the first orders that Captain Smith gives on the bridge, and very soon after the collision as well, within a couple of minutes of the collision, he orders the boilers to be damped. So what happens is that once they've damped it, a lot of the boilers, firemen, go up to the top and are just cooling their heels, just waiting on the deck in their promenade area. But what there is in the engine room is lots of activity. There's a skeleton crew down there, and what they're doing is they are making sure to keep steam up because the steam drove the lights on Titanic, and what they wanted to do was keep the lights burning. In fact, Dan, there was a squash court on Titanic, which was an amazing innovation, and the lights were burning under the seawater, and you could see the green seawater. So people were looking in the viewing gallery of the squash court, and they could see green Atlantic water in there, lit up by these lights that was still burning. So yes, lots of activity around the dynamos and the engine room to keep the lights burning.
Water level rising or still far enough to the stern that they're reasonably dry?
The water level is rising in the bow because what's happening is the weight of water, Dan. So although Titanic weighs 50,000 tons, you can imagine there's thousands of tons of water coming in very quickly. And so what's happening is, imagine, Dan, if you're making sort of ice or something in an ice cube tray, what happens is as Titanic, like an ice cube tray, dips into the water, it fills the first cube, then the second cube, then the third cube. And what happens is the weight of water is getting bigger and bigger. And remember, we talked about how actually there wasn't much damage done by the iceberg. But guess what? As soon as the anchor hawser goes in, you can see at the bow there's that big anchor. That is a huge hole. That hole itself was double the size of the damage that was done by the iceberg as soon as that goes down. So then she starts to sink twice as fast. And guess what? When everyone was ordered up to the lifeboats, they didn't go back down to their rooms to shut their portholes, which they'd been looking out of to see why they'd come to a stop. So what happened is, Dan, these portholes are big, right? And remember, the damage to Titanic isn't that big. So every 2 portholes that goes underwater, it doubles and triples and quadruples the damage to Titanic as she's settling in the water. So Titanic's actually sinking faster and faster and faster.
So 47 minutes past midnight. There is just sort of mixed news, a slightly bit of good news for Titanic, the first in a while, is that someone is actually responding.
Well, it's very good news because all these ships that have responded previously are just too far away to make any difference. And now Carpathia, who was actually heading from America to Europe, she has decided to turn straight around and head for Titanic. Problem is, she's 56 miles away. Now, that might not sound like very long, but Titanic asks her, when do you think you'll get here? How long will it take you? And she says, we'll be with you in about 4 hours. And they know they just haven't got 4 hours done.
For the next 10 minutes, there's more and more lifeboats being lowered now.
That's right. So lifeboats are being lowered the whole time. So there's 20 lifeboats. They lowered about 16 of them. They were lowering them about every 10, 15 minutes. They were lowering them more or less in order. So you've got the sort of lifeboats numbered 1 to sort of 7 going first. Then you've got the later lifeboats coming in. But there are still some things called collapsible lifeboats, Dan. And they're on the top of the bridge around the first funnel area. The ship actually ends up going down with some of those collapsible lifeboats still attached. The lifeboats start going quite quickly. However, the Board of Trade in their wisdom has decided that they have to have a number of able seamen going in each boat to row. Now, Titanic, although she's huge and she could take 3,000 people, she's got less than 50 able seamen on board. And they're the guys that are helping launch the boats. So as each boat goes, more skilled crew are leaving, and actually the lifeboat lowering sequence becomes that little bit slower and slower.
Goodness. And so are they, roughly speaking, going from bow to stern? So
roughly speaking, yes, but they've got a whole crew on the right-hand side with Murdoch lowering all those, and they've got a whole crew on the left-hand side, the port side, with Lightoller lowering those, and then you've got Fifth Officer Lowe, who's lowering the starboard stern set over here, and another officer who's lowering that. So they've almost split up into 4 separate groups, lowering each of the sort of blocks of lifeboats, if you like.
And we've now got the bow pretty much in the water.
That's right. So now the the water actually is coming over the front of Titanic's bow now.
And that means you've also got water pouring through the hole in the bow where the anchor cable...
Every open porthole, every anchor hawser, and there was one on each side, is just opening up Titanic wider and wider to the sea.
We're at 1:15 a.m. on Monday morning. The bow's underwater. Presumably now the passengers have realised this is life and death.
Absolutely right. So people are much whiter, they're much more terrified with fear, their blood's drained out of their cheeks, and they are very, very worried. And there's negotiations going on about who's going to get into a lifeboat, who isn't, because tragically, Dan, in 1912, if you were over 13, you were an adult if you were a man. So they were regarding it as really women and children, but actually teenage sons were not allowed in the lifeboats. And this had an unforeseen consequence, which is a lot of the third-class families, for example, the Goodwins, there were 8 of them ranging from all ages, and they chose to stay together instead of splitting up the younger males and a husband from the daughters and the mother. And there's another reason for that. If we think of socioeconomic times in 1912, it was often the man that was the breadwinner in 1912. And a lot of the first and second class passengers were travelling on business. They had plenty of money. They could replace everything. And there was only a couple of them travelling. So they were sort of nimble to move around the deck. Whereas if you've got a family of 8...
Yeah, you're emigrating.
You're emigrating. You've got all your luggage. You've got everything you own on that ship. You can't replace stuff that's lost. Also, you can't replace the breadwinner if your husband dies very easily. You might be destitute. So I think with third class, they had a lot more to think about. And tragically, a lot of third class, they had every assistance down, women and children, to get to the lifeboats as much as anyone else. But they chose to stay together.
And was that aggro then? Is it increasingly fraught for the officers that are running this evacuation?
We have a particularly fraught time on the starboard side towards the stern of Titanic, which is kind of where these lifeboats are here, because what happens is that a flood of third class passengers does come up from third class and decide to want to get onto the boats, but a lot of the lifeboats are already full. And so people are trying to jump into the lifeboats. Now, in fact, some people did jump into the lifeboats, including first class, and there are stories about people having arms broken, ankles broken by people jumping into the lifeboats. And so what Fifth Officer Lowe does is he actually takes his revolver and fires into the air. And of course, that brings everyone up, sharp and realizes that it's serious. And so that stops a lot of the rushing of the boats.
Oh, right. So he's got a sidearm. He's got a pistol, has he?
Yeah, he's got a pistol because, in fact, the officers were issued with revolvers for times of emergency. And actually, Chief Officer Wilde, at about 1:15, he realizes the situation is very serious. He realizes there are less lifeboats than people, and there could well be a panic. So what he does is he actually calls Lightoller and Murdoch and some of the senior officers together, And the guns, they're Webley revolvers, they're still in their grease, their new grease. And they get the guns out and they actually load them as well. And Lightoller thinks this is all a great waste of time because he wants to be getting on with loading the lifeboats. And they're also extremely heavy, these revolvers. And he thinks, well, how am I going to be able to swim with that?
So 1:30 a.m. right to 1:45, this period, those final lifeboats are being lowered. There's a big clamour to get on. Are we talking big queues, a sort of melee to get on these lifeboats?
That's absolutely right, Dan. It couldn't be more different from when the first lifeboats were launched. They were trying to beg people to get in. The band was playing, sort of lovely classical music, actually comedy music sometimes at that time. By now, Dan, people know it's a very serious situation. They know there's more people wanting to get onto the lifeboats that they can see in front of them than there is room. And so what this crew do is they throw a cordon of linked arms around the lifeboats, and they're actually pushing the people back, and they're allowing women and children through under there between their arms to get into the lifeboats. And then as soon as it's full enough, they're like, right, no more in this boat, lower away.
Is it harder to lower these lifeboats because the ship is so bow down in the water?
Well, because Titanic didn't have a longitudinal bulkhead, she just had bulkheads like this, she actually remained on an even keel for the whole time. And this actually meant, unusually for this, for sea disasters, this actually meant that they continued to be able to lower the lifeboats equally easily on both sides of the ship.
Because usually ships roll onto their side.
That's right. And even when they lift a bit, Dan, it actually puts all the high lifeboats out of operation. So Titanic was actually that was a piece of luck. That was a piece of luck, because had she listed, Dan, she would have actually had the 20 lifeboats she did have cut down to 10.
So there's more people in these last lifeboats. But is it more challenging lowering them?
That's absolutely right, Dan. In fact, we have real confusion with lifeboats number 15 and 13 because there's some fresh water that's sort of being squirted out the sides of the Titanic. It's probably actually pumps. They're pumping the water out and there's a discharge coming out. And it actually means that lifeboats 15 and 13 actually end up on top of each other. And in fact, people are shouting from below, stop lowering, or they're going to get crushed. So luckily, people on the deck actually hear that, and it allows them to cut the falls. They cut the falls with a penknife so that they just chop themselves away, and then the water sort of whooshes them away, and then luckily, the higher lifeboat can then get lowered.
But we've still only got a fraction of the passengers on board into these lifeboats that are now floating around Titanic.
Tragically, there were 2,227 passengers on Titanic. We've also got, remember, we've got like 800 crew. So unfortunately, only about 700 people actually got into lifeboats.
The Bush Guide, cold and smooth survival skills.
We are now at 2:05 in the morning, Monday morning. The final lifeboat is being lowered.
So that was collapsible D, and although it was the last lifeboat launched, in fact, it was one of the collapsible lifeboats.
Right, so these are the more flimsy ones.
That's right. They actually had canvas sides down that you could sort of pull up in an emergency situation. But actually, collapsibles A and B was still attached to the falls or the ropes. So actually, in a way, Titanic sank with those still on the deck. And there's a lot of controversy around this because Ismay, who actually owns the White Star Line, owns Titanic, he actually is standing there. He has been helping. He's been acting like a member of the crew, helping launch the boats. He's got his pajamas on under his suit. He's sweating. He's waving his arms around. Actually, he's annoying the crew. They're like, look, we're handling it. Just leave us alone. But then at that last moment when it is, he knows it's death or there's a space in the boat, and he kind of feels that it's going to be a wasted space in the boat if he doesn't get into it because no one else is allowed to get into it. But he switches from crew to passenger. So suddenly the crew who kind of owns the captain, if you like, suddenly becomes the first class passenger with massive staterooms and suites. And I think, to be fair to him as well, I think Chief Officer Wilde, who's one of his most senior officers, says, look, come on, there's a space for you here, get in. Almost bungles him into the lifeboat. But whatever happens, he ends up regretting it. And he has to live with that decision, that split-second decision, for the rest of his life.
So that boat is lowered with the owner of Titanic in it.
It's a fateful decision. So yes, he saves his life. And who among us can say in the same situation, because thankfully we haven't been in that situation, that we wouldn't try and save ourselves as well. But he makes that decision and he has to live with it. And it comes home to roost very quickly, because when he is got up onto the rescue ship Carpathia, he cannot see any of the other passengers. He he can't face anyone. So he goes into the doctor's cabin, he's shivering, he's delirious. They put him on sedatives, and he stays locked in his cabin for the entire slow, long journey to New York. And everyone's like, where's Ismay? Why were we going so fast? Why did we crash? What's going on? And he refuses to speak to anyone. And really, he does say that it ruined his life. In fact, later on, he does still function as a company director and things like that. But he was very heavily vilified in the press at the time.
What is the mood as you watch that last lifeboat lowered? What's the mood amongst the people remaining on board?
I mean, it's terror and shock. I mean, some people are running around trying to find other lifeboats, not realizing that there aren't any more. The band who bravely played throughout the whole lowering of the lifeboats without trying to get into a lifeboat themselves, they know that the game's up, as it were, and they actually get down to their cabins, they get their instruments, put them on their backs, they take their shoes off. And we know later on that they did actually jump off the ship before it went down completely. But of course, all the survivors said the band played until the end, and they did because they were very brave. But very, very few people survived who weren't in lifeboats. And therefore, the survivors all say the band played until the end. But we actually know, Dan, that they stopped playing about 15 minutes before the ship actually disappeared below the waves.
Captain Smith, unlike Ismay, he's still on board.
He's still on board, and unlike Ismay, he hasn't been panicking like Ismay was loading the boats. He's kept it very calm, and what he's been doing is just quietly going around to each knot of men, lowering the lifeboats, encouraging them, saying, well done, lads. But what he does is he quietly goes around and he says, it's time to abandon ship. It's every man for himself. He's done enough. He even goes to the wireless cabin and says, I release you both. You've done everything you can. Basically stop sending distress message. It's not worth it anymore. And they still stay at their posts. But Smith's job at this stage is to go around and do that. He's also being approached by women holding babies, saying, Captain, what do I do? So he's in this terrible situation. He's also scanning the horizon for the Carpathia to come, or to the Californian, and he's constantly looking around at what's going to be happening next.
So Captain Smith says every man for himself. That just means your work here is done. Do the best you can to save yourself. How does everyone respond to that differently?
So what it was meant to mean was you're no longer required to stick to your post on the ship, and you can save yourself. Now, in fact, we're led to believe that Murdoch didn't want to save himself. He felt personally guilty for having been in charge of Titanic at the time of what became the fatal collision. And there is a French gentleman who very vividly writes a letter home and recalls Murdoch, in fact, after he's launched one of the last sort of proper lifeboats, before the collapsible boats, he is actually standing there more or less with water around his feet, and he actually does a salute, military salute, and then takes the revolver and shoots himself in the head and falls to the deck. And there's a couple of people that corroborate that. So I believe that Murdoch did, in fact, take his own life.
Bites.
At 2:15 a.m, there's a particular event. What happens then?
There's an extraordinary event at 2:15 because it's such a calm night. But suddenly Titanic takes a lunge forward, and this makes people think there's a wave on the North Atlantic, and this wave washes a lot of people into the sea. It actually knocks off the first funnel, which actually crushes. They believe John Jacob Astor was crushed by the first funnel on the starboard wing bridge. So the funnel falls into the starboard wing bridge.
So we've got a wave that's coming over the bows here.
Yeah, that's right. It washes over the top here of the officers' quarters.
Okay.
Now, it washes people that are trying to release collapsibles A and B at the front here. They're trying to cut the falls and release it. It washes them off the deck. But at that point, they know it's pretty much the end. And in fact, Lightoller takes a header dive off the bridge. And in fact, so does Captain Smith. So, in the film, we've got Smith in that dramatic scene and the water's coming up the windows and everything. That didn't happen at all. Smith actually dived into the sea and he was actually found helping babies and children.
Is this the first mass casualty event then, now that there's a wave that's crashed over and swept some people into the freezing cold sea?
That's absolutely right, Dan, because up until now there's been a lot of panic and danger, but actually not a huge amount of deaths aboard Titanic. But what we have here with this wave is the first people being washed into the freezing ocean. Now, they can only survive in there 10 to 20 minutes maximum.
Is this really the end?
It's really the end. And what really signifies that, Dan, is that Titanic's lights have heroically been kept burning by very brave engineers with no thought for saving themselves, keeping the dynamos going, keeping everything running. And suddenly what happens is we get this big wave coming in, which washes people off. But it's part of where the ship actually breaks her back. So the weight of the bow is full of water and the stern up in the air actually snaps. And at that moment, all the lights go out in the ship and everyone knows there's only a matter of 5 minutes left before she sinks.
That bit sticking out of the water, that stern just breaks off.
That's right, because the Titanic is made to be on an even keel and supported all the way along her length. You know, maybe in huge waves, she could take a couple of waves underneath. But when she's got nothing underneath the stern at all, that's 20,000 tons. She's just not designed to hold that in the air. She's designed to float on the water. So there's this ominous, deafening roar which rumbles across the North Atlantic. And survivors believe that this was the boilers breaking loose from their beds, because that's what it sounded like. It sounded like all the pots and pans you can imagine being thrown down the stairs at once. In fact, what we now know is this was actually Titanic breaking her back. We've also got a lot of third-class passengers and other passengers just jumping off the side of the ship. Some of them, tragically, are sucked back into the ship through open portholes where, there's a change in pressure and they're getting sucked in. But generally speaking, most of them, we end up with about 1,500 people in the water on that calm night. What's fascinating, Dan, is as the ship breaks in half, the stern settles back again and people think, oh, the stern's going to stay afloat indefinitely. It's a lifeboat in itself. But unfortunately, there was so much damage done to the keel when the bow pulled apart from the stern that the stern is actually slowly sinking. But the stern stays afloat on its own for about 5 minutes.
So the stern section is now floating separately to the main section. What happens with that? Which one goes down first?
So what happens is, in fact, Jack Thayer notices and does a sketch that the bow actually comes up a bit again, but we don't know whether his sketch is right or not. What we do know is, from the seabed, that Titanic's at about 500 meters apart, both sections, and in fact, the bow kites down to the seabed before the stern. So probably the bow goes down at least a couple of minutes. But remember, the sea's 2 miles deep there. But Titanic's bow is probably not yet hit the ground by the time the stern actually disappeared. So at about 2:17, the bow completely disappears below the waves, never to be seen again until 1985. And it's tearing at the stern like that. And the stern momentarily settles back level in the darkness. And people think, hey, it's going to survive. We're going to be all right here. We're going to float indefinitely. But unfortunately, then the stern itself, rather like the whole ship earlier, the stern itself starts to tip up until it's almost completely on its end. And then it disappears.
And are people jumping off?
People are jumping off, people are screaming, people are actually saying prayers. One of the passengers actually said that it looked like clumps of bees sort of hanging on to capstans and bits of decking and falling off in clumps. So people are sort of hanging onto each other and then falling off.
And we don't know what it was like because almost no one survives after the lifeboats have left Titanic.
Most of the lifeboats had now pulled away to a safe distance because they were worried about being caught in the suction.
At 2:20 a.m., April 15, 1912, RMS Titanic sinks beneath the waters of the North Atlantic Ocean.
20 a.m. and the sea is flat calm. There is no Titanic. The mighty ship that had been there minutes before is just gone. What's the seascape look like?
It's just such a tragic picture, Dan. You've got a few lifeboats dotted around. Most of them can't see each other because they've all sort of split away. But what everyone can hear is this sickening sound, a bit like a football crowd cheering when a goal is scored. You've got 1,500 people just screaming from the top of their lungs, help, come to me. And what they're doing is they're calling the lifeboats back. But I'm afraid in the dark, the lifeboats that are in many cases quite overloaded anyway, but certainly when faced with a crowd of people, it will be like deciding to row your lifeboat into Wembley Stadium to pick people up, and you would just think you would get swamped immediately. So the lifeboats decided they would wait until the cries thinned out a bit, and so it would be more safe to go back. But tragically, by the time the lifeboats did go back, there was very few people were able to be saved. I think about 5 or 6.
Really, so of the people that went really into the water, virtually no one survived.
That's right, Dan. Even people who were in lifeboats like the upturned collapsible or lifeboats that flooded a lot, even they died because the water was actually 2 degrees below freezing. So the rule of thumb basically is if you got submerged, you would probably not survive. Now, Lightoller was a really hard case. He got sucked under with the ship, but he was a real tough guy. He'd already survived shipwreck and things like that. He'd done gold prospecting in the frozen Yukon and stuff like that. Even his sailors called him a hard case, and he did manage to survive on the upturned collapsible B lifeboat.
So he came to the surface, and there was just a floating smaller lifeboat there.
That's right. In fact, the first funnel, when it fell, created a wave which actually pushed the lifeboat. It overturned collapsible B and pushed it away from Titanic. And he was able to reach that along with a number of others, including for a time Captain Smith. But unfortunately, people tended to drop off that during the night. So there was a woman there, I think with some children as well, and they dropped off during the night.
So people just clinging to the other side of this hull, and
That's right, because they just can't cope with the cold, and it's survival of the fittest.
Wow. Did anybody else make it, having been fully submerged, having been aboard Titanic till the end?
Well, the most remarkable story, really, of surviving in the water as opposed to in a lifeboat is a baker called Charles Jocelyn. And he was remarkable because he was the head baker on Titanic, but also he was quite drunk. He drank a lot of alcohol in the moments before the sinking. He filled his pockets with food and biscuits and all sorts of stuff. And he says that he didn't get his head wet as the Titanic sank. He says he stood right on the end there as the bow went and just sort of swam off. But then they wouldn't let him on the lifeboat because they were worried that the air pocket in the upturned collapsible would get sort of, submerged if too many people got on the boat. So they were policing it and they wouldn't let him get on. And then as people died in the night and fell off, then they said, right, now you can come on. So after about an hour or so, when other people had fallen off, he was then allowed to get on, and he did end up surviving. I think, Dan, it's probably because his blood was probably had so much alcohol in it that it was antifreeze.
And what was the last people saw? What was the last confirmed sighting of Captain Smith?
Last confirmed sighting of Captain Smith is he was swimming to this collapsible B because it was the upturned boat that was nearest the officers' quarters, and he had children. He had a child in each arm. He gave the children to the crew on the upturned lifeboat, and they said, "Oh, come on, save yourself, jump on." And he said, "No, I'm all right, boys. I'm all right, lads. Good luck." And then carried on, sort of swimming near the lifeboat, but then would have eventually succumbed to the cold.
So he made the decision not to try and save himself.
That's right. I think he probably have hoped that he would have eventually survived, but he was certainly not going to take up a place on a lifeboat that someone else could have climbed onto.
And the children that Captain Smith had taken to the life raft, did they survive?
Unfortunately, they did not survive.
Four hours later, RMS Carpathia come to the rescue, pick up Titanic survivors, then heads onward to New York City. Alright guys, and that is it for this video today. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Be sure to hit the like, subscribe button. See my future video. See you guys next time. Bye-bye.